Okay, so just quickly before we get started, there is an opportunity in the chat function to post questions for the Q&A, which will be a little bit later in the session. So please don't hesitate to post your questions in there. But without further ado, I think we'll get started on this event today. Thank you so much for everyone attending and for the panelists. I think it will be a very interesting discussion. The event is Indigenous Perspectives on Wellbeing Measurement and Policy Implementation. And we have some very exciting panelists joining us today to have this discussion around conceptualizing and measuring well-being and how we can implement this in policy and what it looks like in practice as well. So thank you for joining us. To get started, we will have Enrique Garcilaso, the Deputy Head of Division and Head of Regional and Rural Policy at the OECD, to give us some opening remarks. So please go ahead, Enrique.
Many thanks, Bridget, and indeed, it's a very exciting topic for us on well-being and Indigenous, two very important elements. Just from our side, I mean, I'm working from the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities within the OECD, and this event is also co-organized with my colleague that will speak after me from the WISE Center. So it's quite interesting to bring these two elements together. On our end, we've been working on Indigenous development related topics for quite some time. We did a global thematic report 2019 called Linking Indigenous Communities with Regional Development. And this report was also supplemented with 3 country case studies. So we looked at the cases of Canada, Australia, and Sweden. And we focused on 4 main thematic areas. The first one was on data issues, assessment, very relevant topics. I'll mention some of the recommendations that I would like to bring into today's discussion. But the second one was more on entrepreneurship and SMEs and looking at what business case studies, what are success stories from Indigenous businesses and people that we could gather and sort of like identify. And then we focused on land use topics and governance and policy. So that's a little bit the report that we did. And within this work, we work very closely with Indigenous communities, and we develop a sort of I would say like a network that we try to bring with us on trying to help disseminate this work in other areas, also within the OECD. Some years later, we also started to work around mining, and we have an initiative called the OECD Mining Regions and Cities Initiative at the OECD that looks at places specialized in mining. So we started to focus more around what is it for Indigenous people within the mining context. And we work with Chile, the north of Chile, and Antofagasta. This initiative looked at events and case studies. Then we did some case studies in Australia, looking at the case study of Pilbara, the case study of Antofagasta in Chile. And that event was quite interesting because it is sort of a strong contrast where you have a lot of wealth being produced by this some of these mines, and then you have a lot of problems or with Indigenous communities trying to get access to some of that wealth. So within that initiative, we had our last event in Sudbury, Canada, and part of the pre-conference, we had an Indigenous-led pre-conference that gathers together, and they develop sort of like a call for action on how to improve outcomes and well-being within Indigenous communities that they're living within a mining context. So that's also quite important for the work. I think we have a fantastic set of panelists today, and just a couple of words around why this measurement of well-being is so important. First of all, within the OECD, we measure well-being at the national, regional scale. We try to focus more put the policy more on the person and trying to identify how can we improve well-being of people, looking less at competitiveness, at sort of like firms, but I would say there's been a sort of like a focus on really trying to focus on the individual and try to understand different measures of well-being. And within the Indigenous, I think well-being takes a different dimension than the ones that statisticians tend to think. There's a lot of physical, mental, spiritual elements that are very important for many Indigenous communities. And part of the work that we did within this global thematic report, we came with two very important recommendations that I like to highlight. The first one was on governance, and we recommended that Indigenous representatives should be included in the governance of national statistical agency, but also on the setting of what types of indicators and what type of data we should be using to measure well-being standards. That should be led not by national agencies, but also by Indigenous communities on what we're measuring and who controls the data. And then the second recommendation that I think it's important is on the reporting. So we suggested that it's important to provide regular reporting of Indigenous well-being outcomes by Indigenous communities. So those were two of the recommendations that came from this thematic report. I look just forward to listening from the panelists, and without further ado, I'll just pass it to my colleague, Laura.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Big welcome from me as well. My name is Lara Fleischer, and I lead our work streams on well-being measurement and policy implementation here at the OECD. I'll start. I have a small presentation to give a brief overview of where we stand with this work, and then look forward to the insights on Indigenous perspectives on well-being that we will hear about from our amazing speakers, to then hopefully in the discussion land on what can we learn from those perspectives and how can these insights be integrated into what we do. So let me share my slides. We practiced it before. No, that's not opening the PowerPoint. Great. I think you can see it now.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So it's really important to kind of define what well-being is for the different communities that you talk to, because depending on the stakeholders, it's really, really very different. So we at the OECD think about well-being as all the outcomes, the economic, social, and environmental outcomes that really matter for people, the planet, and future generations, and that we believe should guide policy evaluation, policy strategy, and really our benchmark of what societal success looks like vis-a-vis a much narrower focus on traditional macroeconomic indicators such as economic growth. It's worth pointing out, without going into much detail here, that there is really increasing international interest in the measurement of well-being and policy application of well-being metrics at the moment, including at the UN, the European Commission, and the G7 finance track levels that we've been working with a lot. So this is a really live agenda and evolving agenda, as we're, I think, all realizing that our ways of working right now are not really delivering the outcomes that we want as societies. The OECD has launched its well-being framework more than a decade ago, and this really guides all of our work of how we are benchmarking countries' performance and well-being and thinking about what principles policy implementation should consider. So it consists of three parts that are maybe worth highlighting here. One are all the different aspects of people's lives that matter to them in the here and now. These span their material conditions, so their income and wealth, their job quality, their housing conditions, but also their quality of life factors, so health, knowledge, and skills, how safe they feel, how they feel about their lives themselves, and their community relations. So how, with whom do we spend our time? How do we spend our time? How connected are we to each other and the institutions that are supposed to serve us? The second aspect that is really important in our definition of well-being is that we look at inequalities of well-being. So we're asking the question, not only is life getting better, but also for whom? And thirdly, there is the sustainability aspect. So which public resources that we think about as natural, human, economic, and social capital do we have to invest in now to guarantee quality of life and well-being for future generations? And just to illustrate to you what it looks like if you take a more integrated well-being approach that looks at all of those aspects together and jointly, I'm just going to share a few insights from our recent report called How is Life that we launched in November. And if you scan that QR code, you can read more here. And there we try to look at how are people in OECD countries doing now, and have they really recovered from the multiple crises and shocks, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, new geopolitical tensions that we've all been facing. And we can really see that, yes, on the one hand, the government interventions that aimed to cushion the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent high inflation have really been quite successful, and they have buffered the financial shocks to households. So if you look at average disposable income, if it's inflation adjusted, that has pretty much recovered or has actually been sustained. And jobs have been at record highs in 2023 and even in early 2024. But if you look at other aspects, so people's housing conditions, how people themselves feel about their financial conditions, if you ask them, are you able to make ends meet? Are you able to keep your house adequately warm? This picture of resilience looks very, very different. And we see quite large numbers of people in OECD countries on average saying that they experience a lot of physical pain, that they feel sad, that they feel worried, also that they feel lonely. That's not shown on this slide. And each of them at the average level of those non-economic aspects has actually worsened in more OECD countries than it has improved in compared to 2019. So we can really see that relying on single metrics to assess crisis recovery, to assess the impact of policies, and really to think about societal progress yields a very incomplete picture. And that's why we think this really people-focused multidimensional approach is needed. At the national level, we have seen that there has been an increasing interest of countries themselves developing well-being frameworks. And by now, about 2/3 of OECD countries, again, at the national level, have developed a national well-being framework. Some of them are more focused on reporting and monitoring and then publishing on well-being outcomes. Those are the blue dots. And some are more explicitly directly trying to influence policy. Those are the yellow dots. And most of them actually have been built on large-scale public consultations where people themselves were asked what is important to you. Obviously, we can discuss in the presentation which people have been asked. Have indigenous communities been asked what is important to you? How's that been integrated here? And the answer is actually very little. You see here New Zealand. That's one example that we'll hear about much more in the panel as well, where we have the Livingston framework from Treasury, but also the Heara Vaiora framework, and apologies for my pronunciation, which is one of the few examples where Indigenous well-being frameworks have been really elevated to the national level, but this hasn't been the case in other OECD countries. So to support our members in the development of their national well-being initiatives, and to also provide a space for peer learning for the government officials that are working on well-being policy implementation, in 2023, we launched a knowledge exchange platform on well-being metrics and policy practice, the CAP for short. Again, if you scan this QR code, and after my presentation, I'll post those links in the chat, you can find out more about all of the initiatives on the previous slide that are there in a public resource portal and in the form of case studies. We won't really have the time here to go in depth into all the different ways that OECD countries are experimenting with well-being policy implementation. There's really different ways to do that. They range from high-level strategic target setting to well-being cost-benefit analysis and policy appraisal to resource allocation, for example, in the budget process. And countries are doing this very differently, which is why there is so much space for peer learning. But what we do see are key emerging principles of well-being informed decision-making that are, also on the slide, and they include this multidimensionality, not only in all the different aspects of people's lives, but then the cross-departmental collaboration, the systemic thinking that comes with that, a focus on equity and inclusion, a focus on people, not again only in asking people themselves what is important to you, but also really prioritizing co-design and collaboration in the design and delivery of programs. And then really importantly, a longer time frame of interest. So how can we look at longer term outcomes that we know really matter? How can we invest early into them and prioritize upstream investment rather than kind of crisis spending when the problems arrive? And really interested to hear from our speakers, including in the discussion of how those ways of working might resonate and what can be expanded here from an Indigenous perspective as well. I will end with just a few reflections that we're internally having on how we can ensure that our OECD guidance is more globally inclusive. So in 2013, we published guidelines, technical guidelines for countries that are interested in collecting data on subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is one of the dimensions in the well-being framework that I showed you earlier, and that refers to how people themselves feel about their lives, how they evaluate their lives. And we're currently updating them with a view of several aspects. The revised guidelines will be published in 2025 Q3. But one of the questions that we asked was, have we been globally inclusive, and what measures of subjective well-being have been developed in non-Western contexts that we haven't considered the first time around? So you see here some of the measures that in that literature review and a lot of experts led interviews, and it's very obvious when you go in detail that many of them have been inspired or built on indigenous models of health. So just to end and give you a few examples of what kind of the other measures of subjective well-being that we found can be categorized into, we see things as on the top left, bit of technical terms here in the subjective well-being measurement literature, but low arousal positive effects. So things like feeling calm, feeling content, feeling in harmony. So pleasant emotions that are, however, not, not as high energy pitches like being happy. Things like relational effect, where your feelings can only be interpreted in relation or in reference to another person's. This is on the top right, so things like feeling respected, feeling envy, feeling compassion. On the bottom left, relational measures where you relate how you feel to another person, and that person or that object of measurement actually doesn't have to be a person. We see a lot of times, and that also comes from indigenous ways of thinking, aspects or concepts like future generations. Do you feel that you're being a good ancestor? And then on the right, communal evaluation. So not asking individuals, how do you feel as an individual, but also how is your family doing? How is your community doing? How's your whānau doing? I hope we will hear more about those aspects as well in the speakers' contributions. And if you're interested in that, stay tuned. There will be a working paper on those globally inclusive measures published in a few weeks' time. And then we're currently reflecting also with a big group of experts on what will be our final guidance in the updated subjective guidelines at the end of 2025. I'll leave it here. Here's my email as well. Really look forward what you think we should still integrate, what we should change, and to learning from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Enrique, for the opening remarks. Now we'll move to our keynote speaker for today, Sasha McMeeking, who is Associate Professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and she will be speaking a little bit about the Māori Wellbeing Framework. So please go ahead, Sasha.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you all. I'll just start very briefly in our language, which is part of Indigenous protocol. Mauri ora ki a tātou, nei rā reo o auraki me koro taranaki ki o koutou, e rere ana ngā mihi matakui ki o koutou, e pāna te kaupapa whakahirahira. That's a blessing on us all and a statement from me about where I come from, which is two of the iwi or tribes in New Zealand, Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Mutunga. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be with you under the mana of the OECD, and I acknowledge that over a decade's worth of leadership that the OECD has done, and the opportunity to join with a community of people here today who are all striving to enhance human flourishing across our planet. It's an honor and it's also an inspiration. So thank you for the opportunity. And Hara Waiora is, I think, significant because it is an Indigenous framework which has been adopted by a central government agency. And across government, it's now operating as a macro public policy framework, which is remarkable, I think. It's been a long time coming, and it's something that is very much valued. It was not created by government. It was created by a collective of pukenga Māori thought leaders who are steeped in traditional knowledge, with some people like me who were there to carry their bags and to be their technical translators, to take their deep knowledge about our understanding of well-being and create it in a form that could be applied across government to create changes. And I'm very conscious that this session has been billed as with a measurement focus. So I'll just do the initial disclosure that Hara Waiora has an aspect of measurement, but it's not measurement focused. The very clearly stated intention of the leaders whose thinking and experience and heart gave rise to Hara Waiora was to rewire the machinery of government. So the aspiration was more than just measuring to create change. It was to rewire the values, the priorities, the assumptions, and the processes that underpin public policy making. And in that sense, to be as pervasive as possible. So while I'll talk a little to measurement, I'm not really measurement's greatest champion, to be fair. And very briefly, because Lara's done such an exceptional job, I just want to acknowledge the global context about how well-being public policy is typically approached so that it can provide a contrast to how the Hara Waiora aims to operate. And as Lara so beautifully talked about, global approaches to well-being typically focus on clearly articulating the conditions for well-being so that we broaden the concept of public value, so that there's a broader and as far as possible a comprehensive statement about the concept of public value that should drive public policy, the material connections, some of the relational elements, and in some jurisdictions, the subjective well-being component. And then there's two principal ways that we see public policy being shaped as a result of that broader notion of public value, which is metrics and targets or directional goal setting. So metrics and targets, we've seen all those fabulous examples in Lara's slide. They rely on an assumption that if we forensically inspect progress, that we will compel change, which isn't unsound, but I think it's worth saying out loud. And then the second approach, which Wales so beautifully displays, is they're having a statutory mandate to form broader strategic goals. And again, that is a really valuable thing. Having directional aids can lead us to a different destination and has in many contexts. I think one of the lessons that Indigenous peoples have learnt, and typically the hard way, is that just forensically measuring or stating a different desired future doesn't necessarily create the transformative change that we aspire to. So Kia ora Waiora recognizes those approaches as working to tweak within the existing machinery. And what we were trying to do was radically change the machinery of public policy making to lead us to a different place. So how Kia ora Waiora operates is that it has a much broader and more comprehensive framing of the concept of public value that firstly identifies what I would consider to be deeper constituent factors of well-being. So in the common global approaches where there's the itemization of material conditions or the prioritization of particular relational or subjective elements, Kia ora Waiora aims to identify deeper intrinsic inherent factors that are necessary for human flourishing. The second thing that Kia ora Waiora aims to do is to scaffold public policy imagination, which I think is a really important contribution that comes from Indigenous knowledge just generally. I love the Einstein quote that a problem cannot be solved from within the same consciousness that it was created. One of the gifts that Indigenous communities have is the opportunity to bring a different consciousness that can help solve some of the grand challenges of our time. And so within Kia ora Waiora, there's quite a number of mechanisms and tools that we aim to change the consciousness and scaffold public policy imagination. And the third part is some process guidance, because in our experience, governments could potentially benefit from exploring different ways of making public policy. So it will speak to each of those ways it operates in turn. So the first one about the deeper constituent factors of well-being, they're reflected in that central image in the three central circles within the design, Wairua, Taiao, and Ira Tangata. And what we're trying to communicate with this is that the source of well-being is Wairua, which can be translated in many ways. It is commonly translated as a spiritual connection or spirituality. Within our discussions, we've talked about it as being connected to something beyond the self. The second sphere is Te Taiao, the natural environment. And so that is positioned before the human aspects of well-being to try and convey a non-human centric way of recognizing the inherent value of the natural world. And then the third sphere is Ira Tangata, the human dimension. And within the human dimension, looking both individually and collectively at four aspects of well-being. Mana tuku iho is about identity. And in this sense, we're framing identity in how a resilient, cohesive identity can enable individuals and collectives to make sense of their life. And I think that's a really important kind of difference that you might expect, because it's really common in Indigenous contexts to see identity as the reclamation of language and cultural practice and the like, which is very important. This includes that within a more expansive way of seeing identity that to self-determine our own futures, our identities need to make sense to ourselves. So that is seen as a fundamental aspect of well-being. Mana tōtutu is the second component of well-being, which is about community belonging. And quite often we talk about community belonging as do I have a sense of trust with someone else? Can I reach out to someone if I feel less resilient than I would like to? The way that mana tōtutu was talked about by our experts was Do I feel a sense of responsibility to contribute? Do I see fully seen as who I am? And so what we were exploring with that is to experience well-being, to flourish, that we need to feel a sense of responsibility to contribute to a community we are connected to, and we need to be wholly seen and accepted with our jewels and our flaws. The third aspect in the human dimension is mana ahanga, which is about capabilities. And when we talked about this, it was, is there a sense of aspiration for a future trajectory and the capabilities to realize it? And the fourth aspect, mana whanake, about having the resources to do that. So for these three spheres of the intrinsic factors of well-being, what I think is really important is that they were seen as interdependent, that all of these things are necessary for human flourishing. And while these are understood within a Māori worldview, they're not seen as confined to iwi Māori. How they are experienced and expressed and what is valued within them will apply across communities. They'll have different components. What matters in terms of the nature of the community or the nature of the identity will differ. But the positioning is that this is Māori knowledge that contributes to well-being that is for the betterment of all. The blue circle on the outside is the process guidance. So we've got 5 values in there: kotahitanga, tikanga, whanaingatanga, tiakitanga, and manaakitanga. And these were process values or instrumental values to guide Crown process. Kotahitanga is framed as government needing to work in a more coordinated way. So this is fundamentally about solving the known problem of siloed government. If we're going to truly solve any of the grand challenges of today, there is no chance that they will solely be within the sphere of one government agency. So the challenge with kotahitanga is to have joined up coordinated government. With manaakitanga, that if we're going to truly advance societal success and that broader sense of well-being, then there needs to be a deep knowledge and ethic of care about people. And that deep knowledge and deep understanding of lived realities is something that governments could arguably get in a deeper and more fulsome sense. Whanaingatanga is about being able to work outside of government as well, recognising that government is not the only thought leader, and government is certainly not the only agency that's capable of delivering to lift well-being outcomes. Tikanga is about displacing the notion that government should be the automatic decision maker. It's about asking what is the right decision maker and what is the right decision-making process for any particular issue. And tiakitanga is about having an intergenerational approach to public policy decision-making. And so the combination of having those deeper constituent factors, the intrinsic ends of well-being and process guidance, was part of having a comprehensive well-being framework. And that scaffolding of imagination is one of what I believe is the really important contributions of Kia ora Waiora that I'd like to talk to. And what has come out of this is, I think, an Indigenous way of conceiving of the upstream-downstream continuum that potentially has value in helping us explore complex causation and layered solution building to genuinely advance well-being. Because if we start from what I hope is not a provocative statement, that just because we measure something does not mean that we will materially shift the dial on that outcome. if we want to genuinely shift the dial, we probably need to think differently and act differently. So what this upstream downstream continuum does is give us a way of understanding the different the interaction of different causative factors in creating any well-being issue, and a way of conceiving packaged policy solutions to advance well-being. And this framework builds on the work of the late and esteemed Professor Manuka Henare, who gifted the initial framework into one of our early Royal Commission processes. And what he identified, and this comes from his positioning in a different tribe, and some people would want to reorder these, but this is his framework and we'll honour it. He identified 4 levels that he thought any policy needed to harmonise across to be effective, which we've expanded on into this upstream downstream continuum. Āhuatanga is about what we can visibly see, the superficial manifestations of a well-being dimension or experience. Ritinga is about the behavioural determinants on well-being, which might include motivation, capability, opportunity, the things that we know shape human behaviours. Tikanga would be the structural determinants, and within those structural determinants is pretty much where I would see a lot of the existing wellbeing frameworks. New Zealand's Living Standards Framework, for example, primarily operates in those structural determinants of wellbeing space. And then the 4th tier is kawa, or the what Professor Manuka Henare will talk about is the paradigm or the moral imperative. And for the way we see it is that the moral imperative, or the big idea that's underpinning well-being and the lived reality of well-being, are those deeper constituent factors that Kia Waiora identifies. The connection to something beyond the self, a cohesive, resilient identity that gives you a sense of aspiration and autonomy to pursue desired futures, whether individually or collectively. And with this framework, what I think we're able to do is to see the, and we do within some of the tools that have come out within Kia Waiora, we can trace causation against those 4 levels. So what are the things that we can observe about a particular phenomena? What are the different behavioral shaping influences on that observed phenomena? What are the structural? And then what are those deeper intrinsic? What are the influences of those deeper intrinsic factors? And equally, we can start to stretch into that space of imagination, because lots of what we see in public policy are solutions that are concentrated in that āhuatanga and that ritinga realm, which is not wrong, but we can't expect transformative outcomes from public policy that's focused in āhuatanga and ritinga domains alone. There seems to be, particularly in wellbeing related policy, a real focus on if we can build capability, if people know better, they will do better, which is not unsound, but pretty much every New Year's resolution has disproved the efficacy of that theory. I'm not sure how many of you are still going to the gym that you promised that you would on the 31st of December. But if we aren't designing packages of policy solutions across all of those areas, arguably we're going to get unsatisfying outcomes no matter how carefully we measure and monitor and aspire to do differently. And I think that's Kia Waiora's real contribution, that it aims to provoke some thinking about the substantive content of policy so that we can materially shift the dial on the wellbeing outcomes that we all experience. That doesn't mean that the realm of metrics is something that we're allergic to. It just means we haven't got there yet. And I think that in the early conversations we've had about how do you measure um, the different deeper constituent factors of well-being, they've been about level of aspiration. They've been about hope. They've been about sense of autonomy that again connect into the lived experience of what those deeper constituent factors mean. And all of this is framed not only by Indigenous knowledge, but by Indigenous experiences. The priority that's placed on connections beyond the self and cohesive and resilient identity is because those are the things that we have had direct experiences of being corroded over time and history. And equally, those are the things that my tōkana awirangi will talk to in final order that we have seen to be the greatest levers of transformative change. And so that makes us wildly optimistic about what Kia ora Waiora could potentially do to public policy making. There is more information available on it. I'm not savvy enough to have a QR code to scan, but there are at least some links on the slide to more information. The Kia ora Waiora handbook has really practical tools to try and scaffold that public policy imagination because we wanted to do more than provide something that might be romantically inspiring. We wanted something that people could use to roll up their sleeves and genuinely use in their day-to-day work of policy analysis and making. And we're really grateful and heartened that the initial feedback we've had on the handbook is that it leads to better, more robust public policy making, that it is useful for the day-to-day reality for policymakers. So really grateful for the opportunity to share this work with this community and connect with the OECD. And we hope this has been a contribution. So I look forward to the conversation at the end, and we'll hand over. Nā reira, tēnā rā koutou.
Thank you, Sasha, for your presentation. Super interesting and important work that you're doing. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you in the Q&A. If you do have questions for Sasha, please pop them in. I see there's some already. But now we'll hand over to some other examples of wellbeing programs that reflect Indigenous principles and ways of working. And we're going to kick off with Peter Storr, who's a postdoctorate fellow at Umeå University in Sweden. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I will try and share my slides to begin with. Let me know if that seems to be working.
Yes, that's great.
Very good. So yes, I'm very grateful to be here. It was a pleasure to listen to your framework from Aotearoa. Very impressive work. Also very impressive work by the OECD. I think my presentation may come across as a little bit crude in relation to that. Perhaps I will say that that may reflect the state of affairs also in my context. But so I am working at Umeå University, which is the northernmost medical university in Sweden, where we have this small Sami health research group that we call LAVO. However, I grew up in the far north of Sweden, so that would be in, let's see if I can point that out for you, Kiruna or Giron in northern Sami language. Giron is a reindeer herding area. It's a poor Sami area in Arctic Sweden. It's also the town with the biggest Sami population probably in Sweden. However, it is also a mining city. It's located in the middle of the Swedish iron ore fields. So it's a town with many, many identities, you could say. But I grew up there with a Sami father and a Swedish mother from southern Sweden. I will begin with a basic problem in my context. We don't know who is a Sami in Sweden, and that has consequences. The last Swedish census recording Sami identity or ethnicity was conducted in 1945. After that, we have repeatedly recognized that we have an issue here. This is quotes from a 1970s Swedish governmental investigation, which found that it's very hard to track or affect any kind of meaningful policy upon Sami because we don't know who is a Sami. This has been repeated by international rapporteurs like the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, for example, in almost 20 years ago now. And so this has consequences in my field, which is health research, particularly mental health research. I work with suicide and suicide prevention mainly. So this has been coming out of reviews, both looking at psychosocial health, also looking at somatic health among the Sami. We really know very little. We have very little data on Sami, demographically speaking about social determinants and also of health outcomes. So to a large extent, Sami are invisible in health research and in these related fields. And of course, this is related to the Swedish and the European history. I'm not aware of any document saying this in Sweden, but so here are some quotes from Statistics Norway when they reasoned about abandoning tracking ethnicity on the Norwegian side, which also is home to Sami people. This is the mid-50s, and they are saying that we're discontinuing to track race because of the wartime circumstances and the difficulties of tracking race because of racial mixing. And so I would argue that both in Norway and in Sweden, Sami ethnicity disappears as a consequence of the European history and the Second World War. Sami in Norway, at least we know, protested against this, and in the three northernmost counties in the last Norwegian census in 1970, Sami ethnicity were included as a consequence of that protest. On the Swedish side, that did not materialize. But of course, at present, both a country like Norway and Sweden, we don't conduct censuses anymore. We rely on national public registers or national identity registers and personal identification numbers. And they don't include Sami ethnicity anymore. And so as a health researcher, that was a basic problem. We have tried to remedy that by creating a Sami health and well-being research infrastructure based on identifying at least parts of the Sami population in Sweden. We have done this through reaching out to the Sami Parliament, which is a national democratically elected body representing the Sami in Sweden, asking to use some of their administrative registers, including their Sami electoral roll, people registered to vote for the Sami Parliament elections, for example. They agreed to us using that for health research purposes, which was perhaps not an easy thing to do. Similar events could not have happened in Norway, for example, where this is a cause for huge debate and conflict in the Sami Parliament there. And of course, this is also related to the historical situation where being Sami was being recognized as Sami potentially could only mean something bad. So at least this is a generational issue, I would say, in our context, where elderly Sami are very careful, cautious about these kinds of topics, whereas younger people are perhaps less aware of the history, but also perhaps a little bit more recognizing that in countries like the Nordic states, if we don't have data, we are invisible. So based on those administrative registers, we could perform a national Swedish Sami public health survey, which was the first time that had ever been done, and this was done in 2021. The kinds of indicators we included were largely taken from a national Swedish public health survey, reflecting social determinants of health, but also things like mental health and well-being. And so based on the data we collected, we could, for example, compare Sami outcomes with Swedish outcomes. Here we're looking at some outcomes where Sami actually report better mental health than Swedish population in general, but also some data points where they report worse. And these, I think, are of interest because we assume that suicide and suicidal behavior that we're seeing here on top, the red dots, are related to mental health. But among Sami, this seems to be somewhat different, perhaps pointing to the need for more nuanced data. These are kind of general Western data indicators I'm showing here, or generally used in Western states. However, we could also look at relationship with language competency, for example, which I think is of great interest, showing that Sami who are not able to speak Sami language consistently reports quite a bit worse mental health on our indicators compared to those Sami who are able to speak the Sami languages. And as we see here, only about 22% of our respondents could speak Sami. So there's huge potential in revitalizing Sami language for mental health, probably. This is cross-sectional data, of course. But these are the kinds of things that we can look on or investigate using our data sets. And so I think change is on the way in the Swedish context. We were supported by the Sami Parliament to we were commissioned to do our research. We were also supported by the National Swedish Public Health Agency to do it. Very recently, just before Christmas, the current Swedish government presented their new national plan for mental health and suicide prevention, including for the very first time ever that I'm aware, meaningful mentioning of the Sami, including the need to track Sami mental health as part of that framework. So hopefully we will see change moving ahead. If we're seeing change, I think including Sami data could, for example, be based upon the Sami health model. It is a little bit of a crude model, I think. Still, it does include lots of the things we also could recognize from Sasha's presentation in relation to meaningful measurements of well-being among the Sami, including language, as you can see there. This is a policy document from the Sami Parliament in Sweden. So to conclude, in my context, I think the underlying issue is that we are not measuring or we are not tracking who is Sami and not. So we're not capturing Sami ethnicity very often in Sweden. There are historical reasons to that. Those historical reasons have turned into normative reasons. We're just not doing it, and people aren't necessarily questioning it. We are seeing some recent progress. I think the key actions there were that we made sure that Indigenous people, in this case the Sami themselves, were on board with this, wanted this. The Sami Parliament said this. We started out using already recognized or established constructs, taking them from the Swedish national levels. Moving ahead, we want to adapt them more to indigenous health models. For example, the Sami health model I've just shown you. However, I think there are some remaining challenges here, and we need to point them out. We still lack lots of policy to support the need for collecting indigenous data in the Swedish context. We don't have the resources to do that either. And also Sami lack capacity because of the marginalization, long-time marginalization of these issues. So Sami do not necessarily have the capacity to join these kinds of endeavors as partners, consultants, or commissioned researchers. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that incredible presentation. Very interesting work, and especially on the metrics and the data collection as well. It's an important points. And before we move on to the Q&A, we have one last speaker, Ewarangi Tamihere, who's CEO of the Wanao Ora Commissioning Agency in New Zealand. So please go ahead.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi mahana kia koutou. So following on from Sasha with our Indigenous greetings from Māori in New Zealand, just joyous greetings to be part of this. And I really want to acknowledge the OECD for putting this on. It's quite inspirational, and when you team to work in a very remote part of the world, it's actually quite heartening to see, to be able to come together and to hear from other like-minded speakers, and just to be amongst the participants online, to know that we're not alone in the journey, to be able to look at enduring outcomes that matter for Indigenous peoples. Sasha has presented you a very cool and amazing Indigenous framework that really is, as she said, about scaffolding public policy using imagination in a different way. And how does that actually be, how is that implemented on the ground with Indigenous peoples? But more importantly, how do you build an Indigenous response to wellbeing that is not just for a moment in time, that is enduring? And so the question here is about how do you build the Indigenous movement for wellbeing? So no matter what government is in place, no matter what obstacles are in place, the Indigenous peoples actually hold the power to make the change themselves. And this underpins a model called Whānau Ora, which is called Family Wellbeing New Zealand. It's a Māori Indigenous wellbeing policy that looks at how do you build change and how do you build wellbeing that starts from an Indigenous perspective, first of all. And it's building on Sasha's actually quote from Einstein and taking it the next step, because it starts from the point of view that I'm not a problem to be solved. I'm a solution waiting to happen. And that underpins the anchor point that wellbeing is based on aspiration. It's not determined by what's wrong with you. It's not determined by that you're a problem. And it's determined by there's hope and belief in the future, because we have to change the way that we view wellbeing if we're really able to change the statistics and what we see in Indigenous wellbeing today. So that frames a different Indigenous type of policy that's implemented on the ground. In the 1990s, saw the emergence for the very first time of Indigenous health providers who had the opportunity to start to deliver health services for themselves. And in the early 2000s, we see a plethora of Indigenous health providers, Māori providers in New Zealand, who have a lot of experience in providing health service delivery and primary care, outreach, community care, and doing it using their own developed cultural models of what's important to them for wellbeing. The Whānau Ora policy 10 years ago took the next step by government and public policy to say it was going to start to devolve very much to Indigenous Māori providers, to say we're going to give you an investment model, and the very first time you can determine what, with that investment, what are the wellbeing approaches and investment outcomes you want to invest in to make the wellbeing that matters most for the communities. So that saw the beginning of 10 years later, a model that we've got in place, the Whānau Ora model, and it's called the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency that commissions the outcomes. We have 116 Indigenous partners, Māori partners that are all Māori providers, that are all undertake wellbeing services. Some just take it in-house, but a lot of our Indigenous Māori partners now are anchors, and they actually deliver health, social services, education, and justice, which is incredible. So they start from an integrated approach to service delivery, which is also very much an important anchor if you're going to look at wellbeing across sectors, across services, not defined and shaped in just one aspect. So when we developed the Commissioning for Outcomes model with 116 partners, what we did was actually commission for outcomes. So we said to partners, you deliver to us what are the outcomes that matter most for the families that you serve in an immediate moment in time, and a short-term outcome, and an intermediate and medium-term outcome, and a longer-term outcome where you have to work collectively with other like-minded organisations to really make the change that matters most for those communities. Now, when you enable Indigenous communities to actually define what the outcomes are that matter most for them, you see an incredible innovation happen on the ground. And also credible ownership about wellbeing. They own the journey of wellbeing. It's not done to them. They're actually able to believe in it. And that's actually the crux of starting to move away from having services that report on contract to actually starting to build a movement. And what was also key in that is that when you have 116 partners, we took away the competition. We took away the competition for bidding for services. It was based on population-based funding. Our partners formed 16 collectives, so the collective impact model. They all came together. They agreed one partner that was the backbone to help measure their outcomes across all of those partners and help to provide support in all of those partners. So when you have 116 partners who are put together in 16 collectives, that have an outcome measurement backbone team that support the measures being collected by families, by partners, and by collectives, you really start to build up a measurement program at a community, at a family level, at a partner level, at a community level. And 10 years later, we're actually able to see over 10 years how you're starting to shift the dial on some of the complex issues such as reducing child poverty. Now, what underpins this farmwater commissioning model is that you can't just commission for outcomes of moment in time. Yes, it's proved we've achieved this many outcomes with this family or in this community. Because one of the issues we have is how are those outcomes enduring? It's all very well investing in it, but we often used to find that those same families, generations later, were still having the same issues. So we did a research project about 8 years ago that what were the significant determinants of well-beings with family over 4 generations, so that we could say what were the catalysts of well-being for success, and that helped us shape an aspirational index as opposed to a deprivational index of well-being. Now, the catalyst for well-being, and Sasha has alluded to some of them, was aspiration, was a sense of community, was leadership, and was culture. Those became the defining anchors for aspiration and a framework of which our outcomes could be modelled and put under those catalysts for well-being, because they started to shape an enduring well-being outcomes model and see that change was happening and being enduring over generations. What is also just as important, as well as being able to demonstrate outcomes by program, by family, by community, a lot of the families that we're dealing with are in crisis. The question is, how are you demonstrating, as some of the frameworks have already been demonstrated before, moving families from crisis to then moving families to being stable, to then moving families for being stable, for families then to be resilient, from families to being resilient, to families being the leaders of their own well-being journey for their families. And then those families are the leaders of their own families, then moving to be the leaders in their communities of well-being. That whole transformative framework that underpins well-being is really important, because that is a significant key that we're finding for outcomes being enduring. So yes, you can measure outcomes in a moment in time, but at the same time, the well-being framework has to be one that's about transformative outcomes that look at transforming families over a journey of change. And so we can show proxies of change with those families at a moment in time. But the most incredible thing is when you're doing this, and I can't mention them all right now, is that when you have 116 Indigenous Māori partners, I'll give you one example, a tribal group that live near a river in the North Island of New Zealand, near Wanganui, and they have developed the most incredible well-being framework that's based on the ebbs and flows of the river of which that tribe is based around. And so not only do we find we have a broad well-being outcomes framework that's Indigenous and Māori, we now see our own partners developing their own well-being frameworks that align to their own communities, align to their own localised beliefs. And that's extremely important, because I know there's a question in the Q&A, I was just looking at it, is that it does not matter for us now 10 years later. Yes, there are challenges when you have new governments come in, but it's far greater than that. Never before have we seen now a movement of 116 Indigenous partners, regardless of what government policy comes in, who continue to want to work together, who continue to want to share the information together about how they share best practice and outcomes, and continue to, regardless, to want to work collectively. Because health and well-being is a complex issue, yes. We cannot all do it on our own. And yes, we hear how we work together collaboratively, but what I'm sharing with you is a model that takes 10 years of building trust, but it is the cornerstone of starting to build an enduring Indigenous approach in New Zealand.
Thank you, Awarangi. Super interesting again presentation. Now we'll move on to the Q&A so that people can ask their questions for the panelists. There's a couple of different options. We have already some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but also if you are wanting to just ask a question spontaneously, please raise your hand and then we can unmute you and you can enter into the discussion as well. We'll just start with some of the questions in the chat. I think the first one was for Sasha. How does cultural capital and sport fit into your framework?
That's a great question because I think that the capitals generally they just are an awkward fit with Indigenous ways of experiencing the world. The capitals framework it's not wrong in our worldview, but it definitely is discordant. So so cultural capital has got well, it's the concept of capitals. It's the assumption that humans can place value on other things with a layer of monetization and what we would call the whakapapa of an idea that is problematic. So the development of the capitals idea comes out of Western economic thinking with a whole bunch of assumptions layered into it. It's just not ours. But what noting that kind of awkwardness with it, cultural capital kind of speaks to the importance of the retention, reclamation of things of culture, language, cultural practices, and so forth. So it is woven into Kia ora waiora, but it doesn't take the concept of cultural capital, which wouldn't fit. All of the dimensions that might be included within cultural capital are somewhere within Kia ora waiora. It's just that they are arranged in a way that comes from us. And in terms of the sport, where does that fit in? So there's kind of two ways of seeing that. Where does tradition-based sport, Indigenous sports fit in? Really cleanly within mana tukuiho identity, mana tautotu, in terms of community belonging, sport being something that is typically done in community. More broadly, the concept of sport, I think Kia ora waiora, one of the understated aspects of Kia ora waiora is that it assumes that well-being comes from, as Awarangi was talking about, self-determination, whether that's in an Indigenous or non-Indigenous context, the ability to make decisions to live a life that is of value to you and or your community. And it's that ability to live a life that is of value, to live a life that there is reason to value, is at the centre of Kia ora waiora. And so sport's one of the ways in which that's manifested or exercised, if that's how you are inclined. I hope that was a reasonable answer.
Yes, thank you, Sasha. There's also another question for you, a little bit around how the framework interacts with the political process of policy making. So maybe you could talk a bit about some of the challenges that you've had in implementation.
So when Kia ora waiora first came into being, it was very well supported. We had the responsible minister for our Treasury, not surprisingly, as the Minister of Finance. And initially, we had a Minister of Finance who was very courageous in wanting to look at centering well-being within public policy, which was fantastic because it meant Kia ora waiora has become a component in our budget process. So new budget spend is assessed against components of Kia ora waiora. And there was, I think, across government, there is a desire to do good and useful things when it comes to well-being, when it comes to Māori generally, and that despite there being lots of tools and resources and frameworks, there's still a degree of confusion about what to actually do practically. So things that offer really practical contributions, like the tools in the handbook, are warmly received by our civil servants. As probably known to many on this call, but not all, New Zealand has since then had a change of appetite in our political leadership, which means that many things related to iwi Māori are in a state of high jeopardy. At the moment, we're really fortunate that Hara Waiora, because it's seen as contributing to more robust policy, it is surviving. It's still sailing well, and we just have to hope that it stays sailing well for the next little while. There is, I think it's really important and right to acknowledge that our Treasury has been really courageous in how they've championed Hara Waiora, and there have been a lot of civil servants across government that have been equally courageous, and quite often academics and people outside government say mean-spirited things about our civil service, and I think it's really important to acknowledge the courage and the heart and the integrity and the genuine intent that have been the most common experience for Hara Waiora.
Thank you, Sasha. We have a question for John Peter. You mentioned a little bit about the lack of resources in implementing these wellbeing frameworks for Sami. What are the steps that are being taken currently to address this lack of capacity?
And that's a good question. I don't think there aren't that many steps taken to address that lack of capacity taken at the moment. Swedish legislation, the Constitution of Sweden recognizes Sami as indigenous peoples, but sector legislation very rarely does. So there are no provisions for specific targets or goals to for example, increase Sami participation in education or resources to kind of fund organizations that could potentially be of service in this space. There are some minor things. The new national plan for mental health and suicide prevention, as I mentioned, that does come with some provision, some small resources to the Sami Parliament, so they hopefully can hire their first health civil service person. So that's the current state of affairs. The Sami Parliament in Sweden does not have a designated person dealing with health matters on full-time basis.
Okay, thank you. And also some more questions for you. Would you say that the situation that you've described in Sweden is also similar in Finland and other countries that have the Sami population? And do the mining towns have better or worse indicators for Sami populations for well-being than other areas?
I don't know specifically what the first question refers to there. I think the Sami health model that I've shown you, that's in a crude way, I think it's representative of Sami people's perspectives in Norway, Sweden, Finland at least. Russia, I'm not so sure. Situation I think is quite similar in Sweden and Finland in general, but different in Norway, with much higher governmental expenditure and much stronger policy supporting all kinds of Sami data collection, for example. From our data set, I think we haven't looked specifically at health outcomes, mining cities versus other municipalities, but we have looked at discrimination in the iron ore fields, as I mentioned. So my place of belonging, and Sami in those two major iron ore towns, they do experience quite a bit higher discrimination, self-reported discrimination, which is of course also related to a great number of especially mental health outcomes.
Okay, great, thank you. And with the data and analysis work that you're doing and the other mental health and well-being measures, someone is asking if there has been next steps in monetizing these impacts and whether that's been conducted or considered.
Sorry, I don't think I really understood the question there.
So with the, I mean, it's not my question, but I'm assuming what the writer means is that with the well-being indicators that the data work that you've done so far, what are the kind of next steps in using this information, other than the health and well-being framework that's been released recently? What do you see the next steps being in using this information?
Well, I think I saw that someone posted questions about deficiency frameworks versus strength-based frameworks, and I think it relates to that. At the moment, we are completely depending on external funders, and at the moment we are only able to, or have only been able to, attract money for kind of looking at deficiencies. So for example, mental health problems, suicidal behavior, more recently violence against Sami women. And I think those topics are super, super important. I'm not one of those saying that we should not look at inequities and these kinds of problems. I think they're very important to look at. But if we're only producing that kind of data, that becomes a problem in the long run, for sure. And I think we are approaching that in our context.
Okay, and now just move to some vocal questions that we'll have. Kate has her hand up, and Lara from the WISE team. I'm not sure who would like to start. Maybe Kate can go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much. So I work in Laura's team and really interested in this. And actually, I was the one that posed this question. I'm not sure it was visible to everybody. So I don't know if I'm oversimplifying the issue, but looking at the examples that we've come across in the past, and I think today we had this really interesting kind of difference in approach. That there's potentially a tension between a traditional approach, a government well-being approach. Often one of the main kind of purposes of the monitoring, we have this well-being approach, and the idea is to identify marginalized groups, to target kind of policy or to channel funding towards these marginalized groups. And of course, that takes a deprivation focus. We're looking at where are the problems that need to be fixed. And I was thinking about this when exactly you're saying we cannot take this idea of we're a problem to be fixed. That often the whole point of an Indigenous-led wellbeing framework is, first of all, that the parameters are just different. The starting point is different. It's not just about kind of more visibility. It's about changing the conversation. And taking a strength-based approach, maybe the actual purpose is different. The purpose is about strengthening the integration of Indigenous perspectives in policy making overall. So first of all, I guess my question is this a simplification of the differences? I think New Zealand's really interesting because you have the Living Standards framework and the Heara Waiora framework together. So my question is there a tension between these two approaches? Does a deprivation approach actually undermine a strengths-based approach, or can we have the two approaches as complementary to kind of serve different purposes in policy making? I hope that's clear, and that's potentially to all panelists. Thank you very much for the fascinating presentations.
Well, I mean, it's not either or. So that's the philosophy we've got to understand is an and. You need both. You're always going to have to help people in terms of a deprivation approach, but you also must have an aspirational approach. One of the bigger questions that we're working with in the whānau space is that when you start to put a model such as whānau in place, a transformative model to see change with families over time, the question that public policy is about answering is that means we're starting to see some families come off welfare. And we've never seen that happen for generations. So actually it's contributing not just to the question of well-being, but if you're looking at what the problem is that you're wanting to be solved by a government overall, is what's another way for actually getting families off welfare, but in a way that sees them continue to be off welfare and grow. So it actually contributes to a bigger question as well, not just for well-being in that moment in time. I don't have the answer to that, but 10 years later, we're able to start to track data that's demonstrating with some of these families that that's occurring.
I'd really love to dive in on that question because it's one of my favorites. And I think deprivation data has told the story of exposed peoples being mad, bad, and sad. That's how we've interpreted that data. How we should have interpreted that data is that as evidence of systemic failure. So deprivation data has a place to tell the story of systemic failure, but we never use it to do that. And I think that's the most important complementarity principle between deprivation data and strengths-based data. Deprivation data identifies points of systemic failure. Strengths-based data gives us real-time insights into actual on-the-ground solutions. So, for example, with many of the whānau that Awarangi's partners work with, at the start, if there had been some data collection, and I'm sure there is, about the beautiful and inspiring attributes within a family, and then over time measuring the growth in those pre-existing capabilities, those pre-existing strengths, then you can track the real-time journey towards a transformative outcome, such as coming off social security. And I think what we try to think that we can do is use deprivation data to give us insights about solutions, and it is fundamentally incapable of giving us anything but retrospective, with high lag insights about whether something worked or not. Strengths-based real-time data on progress. But it's not something we invest in. Despite this period of evidence-obsessed public policy, we're not actually collecting evidence that will give us deep and genuine insights into the relative efficacy of different policy interventions. And I find it utterly confounding. That was my rant. I'm now going to stop.
Thank you, Sasha. Peter, do you have a point on that question?
I think so. As I said, in theory, I don't think that these two things are kind of opposed to each other. In practice, I think they often are, especially if we have marginalized societies like the Sami in Sweden, for example, a very small, numerically speaking, minority in the Swedish context. We have a very limited kind of amount of exposure among policymakers, etc. And so if it's only about deprivation, then that's what we're talking about. However, I think it seems to me also that these conversations are a little bit different in different contexts. When I speak to policymakers in Sweden, I think they are very much aware of social determinants of health, and we are very rapidly moving from, okay, what does this mean, this suicidality outcome or violence against Sami women outcome. Very rapidly, we can shift that conversation also to being about social determinants of health, at least within the context, for example, of the Nordic welfare states. These are very broadly recognized issues. So it may kind of look a little bit different in different contexts.
Thank you. Now we have an attendee with a question with their hand up. So Frederick, if you'd like to go ahead.
It's first of all a privilege to hear you all, some new friends and some older friends. Hi, Petter. Good to see you. And thank you, Awarangi and Sasha. Completely amazing. I have had the privilege to work a lot with Y Center, and I find that this is extremely both positive and painful to hear, of course, what we are listening to. The big thing I'm struck with is the linear idea about capitals and outcomes in the way we're portraying these. And I agree with your critique, Sasha, around capitals, but take it for as it is. The big problem for me is that we may not put the right stuff in the right place. Like there are fundamental ways that people actually are visioning the future, creating community, building all the things that we sometimes put in outcomes, but they actually are capitals. So how do we and I think from what I know from friends with religious backgrounds, it's a much more interdependent kind of relationship between like how life is lived and how that creates conducive conditions for more life for both planets and people and so on. So I think that underlying question is also quite important for the future conversations around Indigenous and other ways of understanding well-being. Yeah, how can we get that conversation even more actively addressed and being part of the CEP? I think that would be really helpful to really build on the strengths-based approach, but how that builds actually economies. It's not only economies that build that. So comments maybe is probably the best to the one who wants to pick it up.
Probably a thank you for the generosity of spirit that's infusing that. And also that sounds like an invitation to more parties and dialogues about complex and geeky things. So fingers crossed. And apart from supporting the spirit of ongoing dialogue, because if any of this was easy, we would have done it already. And genuinely believe in the power of creative dialogue to get us all to places that we could not have foreseen at the beginning of a conversation.
Can I just add, thank you very much. I just think I agree about linear approaches versus non-linear approaches. And for us, from the experience that we've got on the ground, we don't have an answer. There is no one silver bullet. And it's a journey, not a destination. And we have on the ground live data in any moment to make a decision, continue to blueprint the next step. But we never have the answer because the answer is always in control of those on the ground who have the power. And so they should to make whatever they want to do decisions about their well-being in a moment of time. So it's frustrating to some because we don't have the typical logic model approach to it, but it is a journey. And all I can say is a lot of the policy that we're starting to see develop now is beside those who work on the ground to be able to capture that information at time. What is that telling us? And how does it take the next steps in the blueprint of a journey, which we may not be able to answer in our generation, but at least we're continuing the blueprint for how we go further and set the steps for those who follow after us.
Bridget, maybe I'll sorry, just jump in. Just looking at the time, this might be more a comment for all the future collaboration and future exchanges we hope to have that were also echoed. Now, I am really, really interested in how to transfer knowledge and not only keep it in the communities that come up with a solution. So I'm really, really interested, maybe especially Varangi, like how the innovations, the ways of working that you have found in the commissioning agency with the partners and communities you work with, have you been approached by non-Maori health actors that say we want to also learn from that and implement that, or does it kind of remain a separate system? But we can exchange via email, or maybe you have a one minute answer.
Just that's your community has to define it for you. Yes, you can look at other approaches, but you can't just shift a model and put it on another community or put it on a problem say it's going to be resolved until the community that need to be worked with are owning that problem, are owning the solutions. It won't work. They can look at other models, but you can't necessarily put it on another. Is that short enough for the 1 minute approach? Yeah, but you can certainly learn a lot.
Okay, thank you all. Oh, sorry. No, okay. Thank you all for your contributions. It's a shame we've run out of time. I think we could go on for hours on this topic for sure, and potentially, more events in the future around this topic. But thank you so much for the panelists that joined us today and shared the important work that they're doing, and for the attendees as well who asked some really interesting questions. There will be a recording of this webinar. I'll just put the link in the chat where you can find the recording. And also, we we'll be doing kind of a series of webinars around topics related to Indigenous well-being and different topics related to issues and situations for Indigenous communities across the OECD. And you can find updates about those events on our LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way to keep track. So I've also put the link in there. But thank you so much for everyone who attended, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for organizing. Thank you.